Welcome back to the Private Cloud Jumpstart, creating and managing a private cloud with System Center 2012. I'm joined again with Kenan in this next module as we go and we look at the infrastructure components and how we really optimize these for the private cloud. So looking at the flow through the day, we've covered the introduction, we've explained to you the basic concepts of System Center 2012 and how it fits in with the vision of the Microsoft Private Cloud. We then had a module talking about how we actually configure the hardware, the raw hardware components, to prepare them with System Center 2012. So looking at things such as the storage, the networking, and the computational power. In this next module, we're going to think about how do we then take these raw resources and really optimize them for the private cloud. So Kenan, why don't you talk a little more about what we are going to cover in this module?
Great. So like you said, we've built this private cloud infrastructure with all the components, and now what we're going to do is pull it all together and really create your private cloud that you can then use for deploying applications, delegating out to everybody. And really, this is the foundation for what you need before you can start doing all the things you can do with private cloud. Yeah. So what we're going to cover today in our session is four things, basically. We're going to cover the abstraction of taking these private cloud resources and abstracting them into being the private clouds and building the private clouds out of it. Then we're going to talk about the heterogeneity support, or basically support for heterogeneous hypervisors. We want to make sure that these cloud resources are accessed by the correct people and they only have access to the correct resources. So we'll talk about access and then control of what you deploy on the private cloud. So those are the four things we're going to talk about today, and let's get started. All right, so we've talked about this session. You've seen this a couple of times in both Module 1 and a little bit in Module 2. We're going to focus on, again, configure and deploy, but now we're doing it just at the private cloud resources, and we're focusing on the infrastructure management here. Again, you want to do this because you want to make sure that your infrastructure provides support for all the different types of hypervisors you have out there. You want to be able to automate and have this, build this platform for this self-service infrastructure and do it on your terms with whatever you need and how you need to do it to get those operational savings. All right, so with the Module 2, we talked about how we took this diverse infrastructure and we were able to now dedicate or share resources and pull them to create this logical and standardized units. Now, once we have those units, we're going to talk about all the rest of the things you can do with it today. Cloud abstraction, then also delegating pieces of that cloud to the individual users and groups that need to access it, and beyond that, deploying standardized set of services that you as an IT pro have control over, where you don't give that control away and you protect your underlying environment, but you give the self-service users the flexibility they need to deploy the applications they want. All right, so when you're building the private cloud and taking this bunch of infrastructure components and converting it to a private cloud infrastructure, we got to worry about abstraction, abstracting that underlying physical layer and pulling it up into something that we can now make basically compute resources and in logical units that we can assign to different clouds. And we do that by supporting multiple different types of hypervisors, whether it's your VMware, your Citrix, and your Microsoft Hyper-V, obviously. Pulling those all together and using them to create these cloud abstractions. Once we've managed and created these private clouds, we want to ensure that the right people have access to these clouds. We don't want any one user to monopolize all the cloud unless we know that that's okay and we give them the permission to do that. And then lastly, we want to have control over what they deploy on these clouds.
Now, one question I get asked a lot is, we talk about breaking this down into multiple individual clouds within one large private cloud.
Sure.
What would be an example of why a customer would want to break lots of small individual clouds up from their large private cloud?
So I have a big pool of resources, and that pool of resources has to support my finance organization, my HR, my sales, my IT regular just infrastructure resources. And I may want to take, instead of having everybody share all of my resources, I may want to split separate components and have just the finance department use a pool of resources and give them a cloud for just them to use. I may want to have my sales and my HR share the same resources, but I want to separate them and create some logical separation between them. And I can use the cloud concept to do that.
So essentially giving more granular control from this large cloud into much more smaller clouds.
Exactly. And I have lines of business, and they may pay for a certain amount of resources to me if I want to provide some type of chargeback that way. This would allow me to say, okay, you've paid for this amount of resources. Let me block that off and dedicate it to you if I want to. The other thing is, one of the great things about cloud is it's very expandable. It's fluid, and you can add and subtract resources on the fly dynamically. And we'll talk a lot about that during the rest of the session today.
Great.
All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to build that private cloud. We want to do it our way, and we'll do this through abstraction of the resources. So taking that logical and standardized resources and creating this cloud abstraction. Right here, what we're really focusing on is taking those physical resources and basically building it into a logical group. And if we look at this slide right here, what we're doing is we're taking, again, the clouds that we have for specific needs. They could be done for many different reasons. I already talked about maybe I do it by department. The other thing is maybe I do it by location. I have a couple of data centers across the world, and maybe I want to have just clouds for each of those individual data centers to make it easier and delegate administration at the cloud level to those particular users. I can delegate it also as far as role type. Maybe I have a development cloud and I have a production cloud. So I can create multiple different types of clouds, all depending on what's actually important to my business. And every business is going to have a different need, and they're going to be organized differently. And so by being flexible, you can choose how you want to organize this cloud to fit your business needs. So I create the clouds for those specific needs. I can view what's been deployed within that cloud. So I can do it as far as the entire set of resources, or I can do it at an individual cloud level. This allows me to say, okay, in my development environment, these are the different resources I have. And I can see everything if I'm logged in as an administrator, but maybe I want to delegate particular administration to particular users. They will only be able to see the clouds that they have access to, and they'll only be able to see the services that they have access to within there. And then lastly, because the cloud is just this logical representation of resources, I can over-provision, and I can provision across multiple different cloud resources. So we'll show you all about what this means, but really it means that I can create a cloud and I can assign way more resources to that cloud than I have physical resources to support it. And over time, I can add more and more resources to fulfill that need. And it will allow me to basically set up for what they need maybe in the future, but deliver what they need to use now. So that elastic capability of clouds is built into how I can provision out these cloud environments. So when I create a cloud, there are a few things that I have to think about. One of them is, what are the physical hypervisor resources that I'm going to use? Well, I'm going to use things like my servers, whether they're Hyper-V servers or they're VMware servers or Citrix servers. I got to tell it which physical hypervisors that it's going to use, which hosts within the host groups it's going to be using for that cloud. That way I can aggregate different pools of resources. So I may have, VMware servers, and I may stick them in their own host group. I may have Hyper-V servers, I may stick them in their host group, or I may have them combined together. Either way, it doesn't matter. I can just choose by clicking the checkbox on whichever host resources I want to use for this particular cloud. And if I use it for one cloud, that doesn't preclude me from using it for another cloud. I can have multiple clouds share the exact same physical pool of resources.
So what would be the benefit of then having two separate clouds if they're sharing the same group of resources?
Because later on, maybe I'll want to split them. Later on, maybe I'll buy just a set of servers that I want to dedicate to a different, to one of those clouds. I don't want to lock myself into something. I want to be able to spread out and expand as my business needs change. And by allowing them to share resources initially, and then I can pull them out later, it doesn't preclude me from doing that.
It gives you a lot of flexibility.
Exactly.
Right?
And also we talked about in Module 2 about these logical networks. And within the cloud, I choose which of those logical networks are available to my clouds that I assign it. So if it's a development cloud, I'm not going to give it production network resources. I'll just give it the development one. And so I can choose, when I create these clouds, which network resources they have. The other thing is I can choose what storage is available to this cloud. So when I deploy those virtual machines, we again talked in Module 2 about the fabric and the infrastructure components, that the different pieces of storage, I can classify them. Well, I can assign those classified storage to individual clouds. And if there are resources that can have access to that cloud, they'll be able to show up in there. And this is a great thing in that I have different host groups that I've assigned, and if I didn't assign these classified storage to those host groups, then I wouldn't see them in this window. So we're only showing the storage that the host groups that we've assigned to can actually see. We're not going to show you every single classification out there because some of them may not be accessible by the underlying storage here. So I add those things as well as, the library and the capacity, and this allows me to set up how much of the resources I can access by this cloud. So I could have two different clouds share the same physical set of resources, but I could put limits on maybe how many virtual machines they create or how much storage they can use within that pool of resources. Because maybe I'm a small organization and I have a blade chassis and I've filled it all up with servers that I'm going to use for virtualization. I could create one big host group, have all those servers in there, and say, okay, half of the compute resources are going to go to this guy, half are going to go to that guy, but they're all using the same pool of resources, so whoever needs the resources when they're available will be able to take them up and use them. So I can place limits around the physical resources that are consumed, and I can dynamically adjust this. Over time, maybe I set up for 400 virtual CPUs like in this picture here, but over time, the project that was being deployed in this cloud grows and grows and needs more cloud resources. Well, I can just provision more, I can give them more capability or capacity to run more of those resources without having to stop everything, shut everything down, or anything like that.
So no service downtime here. You can just keep adding resources, throwing it into the cloud,
exactly.
And your existing components stay up and running.
Exactly. And if they come up and they start deploying resources, then when they get to a certain point, if they can't deploy anymore, they can just use Service Manager or something like that to create a request for, hey, I need more resources. And then once they get those resources, we can then automatically through, say, an orchestrator runbook or something, provision out more, give them higher level capacity or something like that.
So what you're saying is if I'm a customer and I'm requesting, let's say, 50 new VMs that require 100 gigabytes of RAM, and my cloud only has capacity for 25, even though they're not going to be able to immediately fulfill that request, we can still send a ticket up to the help desk through Service Manager. The help desk can say, oh, hey, this group, this customer needs these resources, and then they could go dynamically provision it, resolve the ticket.
Exactly. Or they may have given them 1,000 gigs of RAM that they needed, and I've only have 150 provisioned. I could be monitoring how much is being used, and as they start deploying more and more servers, find I'm coming closer to that threshold, and I'm going to run out of resources. So what is the next thing I got to do? Well, I got to provision more servers out there, and I can be proactive and expand my cloud as the resources are being used. Instead of buying for peak, I can buy for what's being used right now.
Excellent.
And then lastly, I can choose the types of VMs that this cloud can be deployed in this cloud. If it is a mixed hypervisor environment, maybe I want them to only deploy to Hyper-V or to VMware servers. Well, I can choose that, or I can choose both. And I can also create capability profiles. Now, these capability profiles allow me to create VM definitions of what size VMs that they can create. So I may have a silver VM package which says 1 or 2 virtual CPUs, up to 2.5 gigs of RAM, and maybe a 40 gig hard drive. Then I may have a gold capability profile that says these VMs can be up to 4 virtual CPUs, up to 8 gigs of RAM, and a 120 gig virtual hard drive. And depending on the environment and maybe who bought this cloud or how I created this cloud, I can assign these different capability profiles in there so that these individuals that deploy applications will get just what they paid for. So I have a lot of control now over what gets deployed. So I can set constraints and limits around what that VM is going to look like through capability profiles. And by attaching this to cloud, I can control what size or type of VMs these people can create. Now, one of the things is we're talking about clouds here. We're going to talk a little bit later on in this session about how do I delegate access? So the cloud level, that atomic unit is just one place where I can set these limits. I'll have 2 other places where I can set quota, and we'll talk about that too in the future. So let's show you what that looks like and how to create a cloud. So I'm going to flip over to my demo now.
And what components are you going to be showing in the demo?
So in this demo, I'm going to be talking about the VMM component of System Center 2012. And if you guys were watching Module 2, you can see now that that cluster node that we added at the end of the session has been added into the cluster, and everything's working really fine with that. But let's flip over to these clouds and services. And what you can see here is that I have, within VMM 2012, this new thing called clouds. And inside clouds, I have multiple clouds already created. One is an administration cloud, a customer demographics, and a demographics cloud. And each of these clouds are separated by what types of resources they can access, as well as what actually is allowed to be deployed upon them. So if I wanted to create a brand new cloud, it's as easy as clicking Create Cloud. And we'll call this one Jumpstart, because that's where we are today. And inside the Jumpstart, we'll go and choose which physical resources we want to use. Well, I want to pick just the admin servers. Those are some servers that I have specifically earmarked just for this resource today. And as you can see, we have host groups, and we have host groups within host groups. So I can choose whatever I want. If I wanted to pick this other infrastructure host group, I could do that as well. But I'm just going to pick the admin servers. The other thing is, these are the different network environments that I want to use. And I can choose either development or Contoso or both and give them access to those logical networks. Now, when they deploy a machine, it'll just be surfaced up as which network do you want to deploy to. Development, Contoso, you pick, easy to deploy. Any of the load balancers I have, if I want to choose one of them, I can. I can pick the storage that I want to be able to be used. And, well, I'm only going to pick the secondary storage. I don't want these people in this environment to deploy to that primary storage. My high-end storage. I just want to pick that quick and easy storage for them to use. If I wanted to use any specific library information, I can add that here, or I can do that later on. Here's, like I said, the first place that I can specify capacity. And for these guys, what I'm going to do is I'm only going to create the ability for them to create up to 50 virtual CPUs. Well, let's make it fun. Let's make it 250 virtual CPUs. But they're only going to be able to create up to, let's do 75 virtual machines. So they can deploy any combination of virtual CPUs up to 250 or any number of virtual machines up to 75, but they won't be able to do both. So I have the ability to set limits and capacity that way. For capability profiles, we're going to give them the ability to deploy. There were just Hyper-V servers there, so we'll pick Hyper-V. And then hit go, and it'll create that cloud for me. So I have this cloud created. It's called Jumpstart, has all the different resources that I assigned to it, but there's nothing in there, obviously, because I just created it, so I don't have any services or anything deployed inside of there. What happens if I want to do things like add more servers to this cloud? Well, let's talk about what we do with multi-hypervisor support in this next section here. So flipping back to the session, we're going to talk about now how do we leverage our heterogeneous virtualization environment. We had some poll questions earlier, and they talked that a lot of our customers are running multiple hypervisors within their environment, within their infrastructure. They have a lot of Microsoft, they have a lot of VMware, but they have a lot of customers that are running both.
And Citrix as well, let's not forget.
That's true. Citrix is very, very popular as well, and we have customers running all three of these things together. And when you have these hypervisors deployed, you want a central way of managing them so that it gives you common use across all of these different hypervisors. Once they're attached into VMM, I can deploy virtual machines to any one of those different types of hypervisors, and it doesn't matter. And what it really looks like is this. We wanted to, within System Center, create a consistency with how we manage these multiple hypervisor environments. By having a consistent look and feel, when we deploy applications or services to these hypervisors, it'll just deploy the right virtual machine to the right hypervisor. It's not going to make you have to do something different if it's VMware as opposed to Citrix or as opposed to Microsoft.
So are you saying that there are no different wizards regardless of what you're doing?
The wizards are the same. The things you click on are the same. The differences will be in what's the underlying VHD or VMDK file you're going to use for deploying that virtual machine. Where's that template coming from? And we'll show you all about that through this the next few demos that we're going to do. the other thing is that we want to simplify how a self-service user or someone else that's not really familiar with the underlying workings and the underlying infrastructure components can just deploy the resources they need when they need them without having to worry about all that stuff. And that's what we're doing within VMM. The VMM component is pulling all those things together. So if we look at Virtual Machine Manager, I may have a host group that's out there, and I may have Hyper-V servers that are already there. I may deploy some VMware servers and I'll connect to the vCenter server, or I may connect straight to Citrix Zen server environments. And so I have all these different virtual hypervisors that are out there deployed and ready to go. And inside a host group, I can have either one type of hypervisor or multiple types of hypervisors. The host group is a unit that allows me to create separation for allocating to the clouds, but it doesn't force me into one type of hypervisor per host group. Then once I have these hypervisors within the host group and I've created the clouds and I'm starting to deploy services and such, I can deploy those services to any one of the hypervisors. I can take that same service template and deploy it to another one of those hypervisors. Only thing I would have to do is change what the underlying VHD, VMDK file I'm using, or I can deploy a service that kind of spans both of those hypervisors, where maybe one of the tiers is on Hyper-V and one of the tiers is on VMware. We can allow you to have that flexibility in how you create and deploy these virtualized environments. So let's show you how to bring in some of these heterogeneous hypervisors. And in this example, I'm going to show you how to, through VMM, manage your underlying VMware infrastructure. All right, so switching back to the demo here, what we see is that I have already, in my host groups, I have a few different host servers within this host group, but I want to add now a new server. And we showed you in Module 2 how to add bare metal deploy of a Hyper-V server. Well, here we already have, say, a VMware infrastructure created. And if I look at my servers here, I see that I've already connected to a vCenter server. So I'm already connected to that server. But I want to add more VMware servers that I have out there and bring them under management with VMM. So to do that, I simply, under Add Resources, have to choose VMware ESX hosts and clusters. For the Run As account here, we've talked about that in Module 2, but a Run As account allows me to pre-save credentials that I can use to access different tasks. Well, I need to access I need to log into that ESX server or ESXi server, depending on what I have installed. So I've already created a vSphere admin Run As account. So I'll just use that account. That gives me the root access into those boxes. And I hit Next. It connects to vCenter server and looks at all the different ESX servers that it has access to, and it shows them up to me. I've already added a few to my environment, but I have these other two within my vCenter server. So I'll just click on those to manage them, hit Next here, choose which host group to put it in. I put it in Admin Servers, and then Next, and Finish. And at that point, it'll go through and connect to those servers and start to add them into my into my VMM environment.
Now, we've announced that we support vSphere 4.1. I've actually had a few questions come through asking about support for vSphere 5.0. What is our story with that?
So with VMM 2012, we support vSphere 4.1 only. So whatever vCenter, we're going to connect to vCenter 4.1, and then whatever servers that it can connect to and manage. vCenter 5 came out actually when we were way late in our VM 2012 development cycle. So what we're going to do is, as we update VMM 2012 to support Windows Server A, we're going to look to see if we can support VMware there. Can't guarantee that it's going to be in there. We haven't publicly made that announcement. That's the plan that we're looking at for something like that.
Okay, great.
So we are looking to add those servers, and if we look now under the administrative infrastructure and we look at the admin servers, we see that I now have the Hyper-V server and these two ESX servers within that same host group. And right now we've connected to those servers, but we still can't deploy virtual machines on them until we've done a couple of things. So I'll do some of that configuration so that you can see the types of things you'd have to do to really get this thing up and running inside of VMM. So the first thing I want to do is I need to change this from OK limited to OK. And to do that, we got to get the security key connected and everything. So if we look under management, we see that we need to pull down and retrieve the certificate thumbprint and accept it. The other thing we need to do is under hardware, we need to make sure that the VM NICs within VMware, their vSwitches, map to our logical network so we can deploy VMs to it. So under VM NIC, I have the ability to specify, do I want it to be Contoso or development, which network do I want to use? I'll say the development one. And if you have a distributed virtual switch within vSphere 4.1, we would also allow you just to attach the virtual networks to that, the logical networks to that, which means that we support both the standalone VMware networks or the distributed virtual switches. Once I do those two things, those are pretty much the main things I need to do to get this thing up and running. At that point, I hit OK. And do that for all the different ESX servers that I want to access. As you can see, we move to OK for that one. And if I run those three steps down here for this other one, then I'll be able to use both of these for deploying virtual machines to as well.
Now, while you do that, I'm going to answer a question as well that's come up a few times. The question is, why can't we manage the ESXi host directly or those VMware VMs directly? Well, the reason for that is VMware hasn't exposed its APIs for these individual hosts or for these individual VMs. So we do need to connect through a vCenter server to go and manage that. So essentially, the vCenter server, that's exposed to APIs. We talk to that vCenter server, and then the vCenter server goes and manages those ESXi hosts and the VMs themselves. However, what's the story with Citrix? Do we need XenCenter in there?
So with Citrix, we do not need XenCenter. We support Citrix directly. And basically, Citrix has an integration components that they've built that you install inside of the XenCenter server, the Xen server. And at that point, it will make it basically appear to VMM as another type of server that we can manage directly. We don't have to go through VMM or XenCenter for that.
Great.
One other thing about the vCenter server is that a lot of things that VMware wrote are orchestrated or run through vCenter. And so without vCenter, you can't do things like live migration. Where with Hyper-V, I can do live migration without VMM.
Directly on the host, of
so
course.
Those are a little different in how they've architected their environment, which means we have to use vCenter server for those types of things. And if I have a VM that's up and running, and I need to live migrate it, if it's running on ESX server, that's fine. I just hit right-click on it and say migrate, and it'll migrate it from the original vMotion. It'll vMotion it from the original ESX to the other ESX. So we support all those things as well once it's managed by VMM. So I have these servers in there. One of the things that people say is, well, I've built my VMware environment, and I already have all these templates there. I don't want to take those templates. And with VMM 2008, I would copy that entire template into the VMM library, which means that every time I deployed a new VM, it would have to copy the whole VM back across the network to the ESX server. Well, what we've done with VMM 2012 is we've allowed you to leave the template on the vCenter server. And what we do is we import just the metadata of that template. By importing the metadata of that template, what that means is that we know what that template looks like, what's the characteristics of the VM, and when we want to deploy a new VM, we just say, hey, vCenter, deploy it out for us. We don't have to connect to and copy the whole VMDK and everything to the server. And how we do that is through our library. Inside the library of VMM, I have the ability to import a VMware template. When I click Import VMware Template, it shows me all the templates that vCenter has available, and we click on the ones that we want to import. And so I have these two templates here. One's a server template, and the other one is an app server template. I'm going to import both of them. And at this point, we're just basically taking that metadata, pulling it in, and we have them now as part of our VM template list. And I could simply right-click on this and create a new virtual machine from it. But what I want to do is, and we'll show you why later on in this session, is I want to basically create a new template off of that existing VM template. So I'm going to go create VM template from that template. We'll call this one ESX template 01 as just a name that we could use. And we go through the different steps, and it has all the information about that virtual machine that we created. 2 processors, a gig of RAM. As you can see, it has the SCSI adapter and everything set instead of having the IDE disk, like we would see in Hyper-V. It has a SCSI attached virtual disk. High availability because it's on a vMotionable machine. You can pick the type of network that you want for it, and all those information will be there. But what you'll also see is that you can fill in all the VMM information as far as the operating system and things that we're going to talk about later, like building the application stuff on there. So I'm not going to finish this one right here. Instead, I'm going to edit this template right here and do one thing that I have to do before I deploy virtual machines off of there, and that is under the hardware configuration. I have to say that the virtual hard disk contains the operating system. By doing that, now I can start deploying all new virtual machines off of this one template here. All right, so that's multi-hypervisor management. We'll show you a bunch of other stuff later on as we start creating new services and those types of things in this session today. But I wanted to give you a grounding on how do we add those hypervisors in there and how we can leverage them. Now that these servers are up and ready to go, the next thing and the last thing I'd have to do is in my Jumpstart cloud to take advantage of them. If I look at the properties here, under resources, I'm using that infrastructure group, and now you see we have 6 servers instead of the 2 that were there before, or 6 CPUs instead of the 2 that were there before. But I have to change the capability profiles to really use these servers. I got to say that I can deploy VMware ESX VMs on there. All right, so that's all I need to do. This guy's ready to go to deploy new servers to that ESX box. So now let's flip back and talk a little bit about, I've put this cloud together. I've managed the underlying access. The next thing I want to do now is delegate who has access to these cloud resources that I've created. So that's an important aspect in that I want to ensure that the users that access my cloud are the right users and they have access to the correct resources and they only use what I allow them to use. I don't want them to just be able to create a bunch of VMs and use up all my resources. So I need to have the ability to set limits to there. And I do that by taking this cloud abstraction and delegating the capacity on who has access to it. It's carving up those different clouds for the different groups that I want to have access to. Like if I deploy this in this example, this picture here, I have development and production. Well, in production, I may have both HR people and finance people using the same pool of resources. I don't want them all to use all those resources. I may want to split it out because HR only bought a certain amount of resources, so I'm only going to give them that much. They can't steal it from everybody else.
So is this the basic security model that the Microsoft Private Cloud uses as far as delegating access and control? And is that integrated with Active Directory, or how is that managed?
So it is integrated into Active Directory, and we have a couple of ways of managing it. And one of them is through Delegated Administrator, where they can be an administrator that has access to different resources. Of those resources, they have administrative access. Or we can create what we call self-service users. And those self-service users are only visible, can only see the clouds that we've given them permission to, and then we can create permissions off of there. All of those are set up by Active Directory accounts. So in other words, I create a user role inside of VMM, and that you fill it in with which Active Directory accounts have access to that role. When they log in, they pick that user role, and they have access to just those VMs. So let's take a look at what that actually means. I have both delegated administrator access, which has the ability to have administrative access to both host groups as well as clouds, but only at this level that I specified for them. Or I have self-service users, and they have access just to clouds, and they have the ability to specify how much quota they have and what kind of actions they can take within that cloud. So I have the ability to assign actions to these user roles. An action allows me to do things like deploy a virtual machine, start, stop, shut down, connect to, those types of things. But it also allows me to specify as an administrator, as an IT guy, which types of virtual machines they can deploy. Maybe I don't want them to author new VMs, so I don't give them that permission. Maybe I want them to be able to deploy VMs, but only from existing templates that I've created. I don't want them to say, deploy a new VM and just start filling it out with a bunch of different resources. I want to say, okay, these are the templates I have created. These are the ones that you can deploy. And I can give them that permission here. So I can specify different custom roles for different users. I can choose what actions they can perform. And I can change that on the fly. Maybe I've given them access to deploy VMs. after they've deployed their pool of VMs they need, I can pull that capability away and just give them the ability of those VMs to start, stop, or something like that. And then lastly, it uses Active Directory users and groups when I create these different user roles. And you'll see that in the demo a few minutes from now. The other thing I can do is specify quota for these different machines. So we had the ability, and we showed earlier, that we were able to set quota at the cloud level. Well, we also can set quota at the all members combined level. This means that if I sum up all the different users that have logged in as this user role, all the different number of virtual CPUs that they've created, they can't create more than 100 virtual CPUs, sum total across all of them. And if I wanted to, I could even limit that even further at the per user level and say that any one particular user can only create a certain number of VMs. So in this example here, I have 50 virtual machines that I've created the limit on for this user role at the all users level, but any one user can only create up to 10 virtual machines. So if I've deployed 10 virtual machines, unless I delete or archive one of those virtual machines away from that system, I won't be able to deploy any more until I've either added more capacity by modifying this, or I've deleted or removed some of those. All right, so let's talk a little bit about and show you what that actually means. So I'm going to flip over to the VMM machine again and show you how we've created these different delegated access for these cloud resources.
Now, as you're switching over, there's a question. What about ASMAN, Authorization Manager? How does this fit in with these different Hyper-V roles, virtualization roles?
So the VMM is different than a Hyper-V role. So VMM is what has access to the Hyper-V machines and deploys the systems. VMM would be you create the roles inside of VMM, and VMM allows you to deploy these virtual machines out, but it doesn't. It's not affected by the ASMAN roles on a Hyper-V server itself.
Okay.
As far as I've used it. So if we look here within VMM, I already have a few different user roles created. I have a couple of delegated administrator roles. I have obviously the administrator role and a couple of self-service user roles already. So to create a user role, let's create a new user role that will access that cloud that we were going to create that we created earlier. So I'm going to call this Jumpstart Users, and inside of there we have a profile, and we're going to use a self-service user. We're going to pick the Active Directory users that we want to add inside of here. So we will add, we go to HR, I'm sorry, it's I think it's HR, this is cloud users, which would be an Active Directory group, or I could add in a particular user like cloud admin 02. And so I can add both users and groups into this particular user role. Under Next, I pick the scope. I'm going to choose just the Jumpstart Cloud. So if I log in as a member of this user role, I only have access to the Jumpstart Cloud and all the resources that I've been given through quota on there. And if we go to the next slide, we see the different quota. Here's where we created the limit of 250 virtual CPUs. We can use that limit, or we can cut things down. And if we look inside of this this graph here, we also have the ability of number of virtual machines, 75. Well, I may only want this user role to create, like we showed in the slide deck, 50 virtual machines. And then any one particular user, I'm going to give them the ability to only create 4 VMs. So any one user can create 4 VMs. The sum total of all VMs created within this cloud can be 50, or I hit the 250 vCPU maximum within there. Depending on how I create things out, I may do that, I probably won't. Then I can choose any particular types of resources this person has access to. Well, I want to have access to these customer demographic services that I've created, and And let's add a couple of these other VM templates and hardware profiles. So I have given them access to these particular resources. And then next is what kind of activities or actions they can create. Well, I want them to be able to deploy, but only from a template. I want to give them the ability to connect to the virtual machines they create, so remote connection. And then I just want them to be able to start, shut down, and stop. And if they want, and I want them to be able to store and redeploy. By creating store and redeploy, that means they can store it in the library so it won't count against their quota, and they can redeploy it later on when they want it. If I take that away, the only way to free up quota would be to delete virtual machines. If I wanted to add any particular run as accounts, I could do that then, and then finish. So at this point, it's created a brand new resource group called Jumpstart Users, and this Jumpstart Users user role has the ability to do just certain tasks.
Now, I had a question that came in about sharing these roles and sharing these accounts between the different System Center components. Mm-hmm. So, for example, accounts that I create in VMM, can I use those in Operations Manager? Is there any shared infrastructure there?
Each infrastructure component, each System Center component has its own user roles or identity management. So, if I create a user called Cloud Users here or Jumpstart Users here, that doesn't get populated to Operations Manager or Service Manager within there. Now, you could create Orchestrator Runbooks that does those types of things, but the people that are accessing VMM are probably not the same people that are going to be accessing Operations Manager. The user roles right here would be something that would be effective for, and we'll talk about it later in probably a couple of modules during the application performance stuff, where when you deploy a service, when they log into App Controller, it'll leverage the VMM user roles. But each user role set is defined for that application or for that component.
Now, what about if I used Active Directory and I created a group, let's say our cloud group? Could I import all the users in that entire group, in that organization or unit, into VMM and apply these security credentials across that whole group?
So if I had an Active Directory group called Cloud Users and I created a user role and I added Cloud Users to that, then when the person logged into VMM, it would either, if that was the only user role he was added to access by, it would allow him to log into that. If it was multiple user roles, it would give him a choice. And so what it looks like is this. If I'm a brand new user and I want to log in, so I'm going to log in to this user, but I'm going to specify credentials. And I'm going to log in as Cloud Admin 02. And he was that individual user that I created when I logged in, or when I added him to the users, to the user role. If I have access to multiple user roles, it's going to give me a dialog box like this, and I can choose which user role I want to choose and log in as, and it'll give me just those permissions. So I'm going to pick Jumpstart Users here, which is the one that we just created. And you're going to see a couple of things that are different than when you saw the administrative view that I had as logged in as administrator. And the first thing you're going to notice is that some of the tabs or some of the workspaces just aren't there. If we look down here at the workspaces, we see VMs and services and library, but we don't see that fabric, which is right in between. If I tab back to the administrator one, we see VMs and services, fabric, and library. So they do give you just contextual views of what you can see. The other thing, if we look in VMs and services, I don't see all those host groups or anything. All I see is the service or the cloud that I've been given permission to see. And then lastly, if I wanted to deploy a brand new service or VMs, and I tried to deploy something, I would only see the VMs or the services that I have access to deploy. So if I go into library, I can see just the services that I have the ability to deploy. If I right-click on them, I can configure deployment. But we're going to talk about that in a few minutes here, so what that all looks like. But that's where I can specify and set up how each of these individual things, who gets access to what and what permissions. And to be honest, if I was a self-service user, I'm probably not going to log into the VMM console, but instead I'll log into App Controller and use that web front end to be able to do this much more simply than getting this this complex UI for them.
Right, that's our self-service portal, of course, app controller. So if you're just
Exactly.
kind of a standard user, an end user, without needing this full administrative access to manage all the hosts, the fabrics, chances are you're going to use app controller anyway.
Exactly, exactly. So let's flip back to the session here and start talking now about these services. One of the benefits that we've added within VMM 2012 and for System Center itself is this focus on the application. A lot of customers deploy a lot of virtual machines, but those virtual machines are usually a grouping of virtual machines that are deployed together. I mean, I usually have an application I have to deploy, and it's going to take a certain number of VMs for the web front tier, some for the middle tier, and then something probably for a back-end database, like a SQL Server or something like that. So how do I bring all those things together and make it more simple to deploy these what are more and more complex type applications? And that's what we're trying to do with VMM 2012 and System Center 2012 is bring that focus on the application and not on the individual virtual machines that are out there.
Well, I think that's one of the big advantages that System Center brings to the table as well compared to some competitive products. You know, not only do we manage the fabric, the physical hardware, we manage the VMs, but then we manage the applications that are running inside the VMs as well. So we really do hit all the different tiers to get that deep depth, deep monitoring and application insight.
Exactly, and not only do we hit them all, but we correlate them together. So I know when I deploy this service, it's running on these hosts, which means that I know if there's a problem, I can drill down quickly into what's the problem with the infrastructure, or is it a problem with the application on top of it. And we do that by creating these service templates or the service model. And the service model is, let's say for a typical .NET application, has multiple tiers. And each of those tiers have different virtual machines requirements. Maybe I have a web tier that really requires not a lot of CPU or storage, but maybe it needs a lot of memory or something like that. Or I have an application tier that really needs a lot of CPU to chug away at something, and data tier that needs access to that high-end storage. I can create different virtual machine templates, and those templates are different in VMM 2012 than what a normal application environment thinks about, because in VMM 2012 it's not just the OS and the hardware and the virtual hard disk, but we also focus on that application that's installed in that tier. So I take that different tier that we have here, this service template, and it may consist of multiple virtual machine templates, but each one of those tiers may have one or more virtual machines deployed. And those virtual machines are deployed and stored on the cloud that I deploy it to. So if we look at what is a service template, it's a bunch of virtual machine templates. Each template has, like I said, the hardware profile, whether it's a VHD for Hyper-V or for Citrix Xen Server, or it's a VMDK for VMware. It has the OS settings, you know, when I deploy this, what OS is it going to be installed on, what's the domain join, all that information. But it also has an application profile. If it's a web tier, then you would probably use an MS Deploy package and the configuration pre and post install of that. If it's the application tier, it's probably going to use Server App V, which is basically your client app V stuff, but built for managing at the server service level. So we're using Server App V, and it also would have some configuration information that you may need to inject into that when you're configuring it. And then lastly, your data tier, whether it's a physical SQL Server you want to connect to or it's a virtual machine running SQL Server, you can manage that within this service template. We bring that all together and we store that in the library, the service template portion of the VMM library. And by being stored in the library, we can export it and copy it to other services, other VMMs that are out there, and really take this model into heart. And what it really allows me to do is, VMM allows me to quickly create new services by basically dragging and dropping the different templates or the different tiers onto a service designer window and building that interrelation and connection between them. So I have the service template designer that allows me to do things like use the ribbon for any contextual things I need to do, like adding a connector between there and multiple NICs, another load balancer or something like that. I can use the designer canvas to quickly drag and drop and pull all the different VMs templates that I need together into this mix. And then lastly, I can set how these services are related to each other, such as maybe I want to specify a release number on these virtual machines, on this service template, so I can use it to update machines easier, which we'll talk about in the monitor and operate section of it, of these modules. Or I want to add a cost center, a description, all those different types of information that are at the service level. I can add them in there. Once I've created this service template, I then need to deploy it. And to deploy this service, I have a deployment preview window. So I say deploy the service. It asks me what cloud do I want to deploy to. The preview pane shows me things like what's that virtual machine's name going to be, what network it's connected to, all those different things like that. Then I also have the ability to set contextual settings or deployment time specific variable settings, which means that this particular middle tier, application tier, has to talk to this particular SQL server. And so when I deployed the application, created the template, and originally it was talking to my dev SQL server, but I wanted to talk to my production SQL server. So I can actually create a specific variable that I can fill in at deploy time, that when I deploy this service, it will inject that into either the scripts that I'm using or into the application itself, so that it knows where, in which SQL server it's supposed to deploy to. And then lastly, again, I can use a ribbon to do things like, if I'm getting red X's for any of these reasons, I can check why they're failing, or when I'm ready to deploy, I can hit deploy. Once I've deployed this service, I can view what it looks like all the way down to the information regarding that application that was deployed within that tier. And we'll show you what this looks like in a few minutes as well. But this means that I can look at the service level and do service level actions. I can look at it at the tier level and do tier level actions like scale out. I can look at it at the virtual machine level or even at the application level that's deployed on there. So I can perform operations at any of those levels and view all the specifics for that machine at those different tiers. And then also, because I have a connector to our Operations Manager component, I can, as I deploy this service, it gets injected as a distributed application into Operations Manager. So now I have the ability to monitor it in the monitoring aspects of Operations Manager. And by being created there, it gets created as a business service inside of Service Manager. So I have this interconnection between all of our different System Center processes. And I can monitor at the tier level or view what's happening at the virtual machine level within my monitoring tools. So let's talk about, and let's show you now how VMM allows you to create these different virtual machines and these different service templates and everything. And then when we go to the monitor and operate section, I'll show you what exactly that looks like when it's pulled over into Operations Manager. All right. So I'm here inside of VMM, and if I go to my library, we see that I have a bunch of different VM templates that are available. I have both the existing Hyper-V templates that I've already created and those two VMware templates, or ESX templates that I just imported. Well, what I want to do now is take that Windows Server template I imported from ESX, and I'm going to create a brand new VM template off of there. And the reason for that is I want to use it as a template that I'm going to use to deploy pieces of my service. And I'm going to call this ESX app tier. And it's just an application tier for my service here. The configure hardware capabilities, 2 processor, a gig of RAM, all those different types of things. The other thing is that it's attached to the hard disk, which contains the operating system. So everything's set up and ready to go. The other things I want to make sure I set is whether I want to choose which network I want to use. I'm going to say the Contoso development or the development network instead of the production, though it doesn't matter. I could pick either. Actually, I'll just leave it as the production. Then high availability means that this machine can be vMotioned around. So that's common to all different virtual machine vendors. Virtualization vendors have that capability. Then the next thing I want to do is specify things like, what's this machine name going to be? So I want this one to be called ESXOP, and I'll go pound, pound, pound. By adding those pounds in there, when I deploy the virtual machine, it's going to take a look at what was the last type of this virtual machine that was deployed, and it'll use the next number up from that. So I'll have unique naming within that. The admin password, well, I wanted to use the run as account that I have accessible to me. So I'm going to use a domain. Well, no, for local admin, I want to use the local admin account. Product key, if I want to type in my product key, I can do it there. All that stuff's the same. Here's something new in templates, and we can do this whether it's a Hyper-V VM or it's a VMware or a Citrix Zen Server VM template. That is, I can specify roles and features. So at deployment time, it'll actually enable those roles for me. And some of the roles that I may want to enable, this is, let's say, it's a this is going to be an application server that's going to need to have some of the web services stuff enabled. So I'll turn on the things that I need on the web services. And at this point, I'm clicking a bunch of different things because I'm just showing you what it is, not necessarily all the different capabilities that you have. The other thing I may want to do is turn on where is it? This is also going to be part of a file server, so I'm going to turn on the file services as well. So I have some of the different services that I need to take. And then how many times do you have to turn on the .NET 3.51 feature inside of your server when you deploy? It's pretty much every time or whatever.
Often.
So I'm going to just turn that stuff on already. So it's already there and available. I'm going to turn on bits. And now we have this server set up for what I need. The last step is, what domain and everything it's going to deploy to. So I'm going to pick the domain. Instead of typing in all the administrative stuff, I'll pick my domain run as account. So I have all that stuff right there for me and ready to go. And that is really all I need. And that's what pretty much all different virtualization vendors allow me to do for creating virtual machines. One thing we've added with VMM is the ability to configure that application that's going to be installed on top of this virtual machine. So right now, I have this existing virtual machine that's been created. It would have it right now an OS and its own identity, and it would be up on the network. But for normal virtualization solutions, I'd have to now go back in and do all that customization and configuration of the machine afterwards. Well, what I want to do is I just want to add those pre-created applications that I have already in here. So I can just add a new virtual application, and we'll call this the order processing. And we'll pick which application we want to use. And we're going to choose the ST5 order processor. We're going to hit OK there. And as you can see, there's a couple of config information here. We're already using this config SQL con, and they have a string and they have value of data that's in there. So we have a lot of this stuff already created. And what this means is that we have these variables that are available, and some of them will be pre-created and just shipped right into the machine because maybe I have a configuration variable I want set. Others of them may be variables that I'll pass in at deploy time. And some of those would be things like maybe I want to use a passable parameter or something like that. Then not only do I need to add that, but I want to add into it also a application pre-install script. So I can create all this different layer of what types of things do I need to do before I install the application, then what types of things do I need to do after I install the application. And pre-install here, I'm going to run cmd.exe, and the parameters are going to be at jumpstart name at, and so I'll be able to type in at deploy time what the parameters for that command executable are going to be. If I click under browse, I can choose what application I want to deploy, and And I'm going to deploy this one right here, if I scroll this out right. I'm going to pick the, yep, that one right there. And I hit OK. And now I can go through and click on the next thing. If it was doing a SQL Server, I could do all the SQL information right here. And then lastly, create this new script. So now I have a new virtual machine created, virtual machine template created called ESX app tier, built off of the Windows Server template that I had imported earlier. And now that I have these things created, the next thing I want to do is create a brand new service tier. So I'm going to just go create service template. And I can use one of these pre-configured patterns, or I can create just a brand new one. I will call this one mix service, because I'm actually going to have both Hyper-V VMs and VMware VMs inside of here. We'll give it version 1.0. It'll be a standard 3-tier type application, and we'll hit OK. And it's going to pull out the existing piece of this template and give me what that looks like. I have 3 different tiers here. Well, I need first a web tier, so I just simply take this existing VM template that I have here, drag and drop it on. That's a web application. This web application is built against a Hyper-V system, so that's all set up and ready to go. The next thing I want to do is add the SQL tier, so I'll drop that in on my 3rd tier. And that has all the different, in SQL tier, all the different DAC packs that I need to install on top of the actual SQL Server that it's going to deploy for me. And then lastly, I'm going to take that new ESX app tier for my application tier and drop that into the middle tier. So what we've seen right here, and let me zoom this out just a tiny bit, is that we have a 3-tier application, and this 3-tier application has an ESX VM, a Hyper-V VM, and a Hyper-V SQL Server. And in each of these tiers, I've actually specified whether or not these machines can be scaled out and what order they deploy in. And I want the ESX app tier to deploy second, and I want the StockTrader 5 web tier to deploy first. And this one is a web tier that I want to create a load balance cluster of 3 nodes. So I've set that up to be a default instance count of 3, maximum of 5. I'm also going to add a couple of upgrade domains. And by adding upgrade domains, it means that when I want to service this tier, it'll service just pieces of it, that tier, at a time, so it won't bring the whole tier down just to do servicing action. And then lastly, on my computer tier, I'm going to leave that as just 1. All right, so now I should, by saving and validating, should get rid of most, if not all, of these errors, and it should be able to configure a deployment of this service.
Now, I got asked a question. Is there any type of best practice analyzer to validate a service tier? And it looks like you're just showing one. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is actually doing, what it's verifying?
So the things that we verify when we hit save and validate, we're verifying that they're connecting to a network and that the network is a proper network for what that VM has attached to it. We're testing to see whether or not there are any hiccups as far as there's something wrong with the VM template itself to make sure that it will deploy. Now, it may not deploy because I may not have enough quota, I may not have enough machines or something like that, but at least the service configuration itself is created in such a way that each of the VM templates are valid and they're set up in a way that they can.
So the service should be functional, assuming you have enough resources to support it?
Provided that each of the applications are, I mean, the VMs will deploy, it'll run through all the service tasks. Now, every time you deploy a service, you'll have a job, and that job will run. And what you'll see is that over time, whether it'll be successful or not will really determine whether this thing can be deployed. And some things may happen, well, it has to be part of the domain, you log into the domain, can you get access to it after it finishes deploying? It has a lot of different windows and it takes time to deploy this type of service out. But when something fails, it'll tell you where it failed and what happened, so you can then dig down deep, whether it's something that you have to change or whether you just have to, it timed out or something, you just have to rerun the deployment again. So now that I've set that up, let's configure deployment. And already I know that this is going to fail, but I'll show you why in a few minutes, because what we're going to do is we're going to configure the deployment of this machine, and we're going to choose that cloud that we just created, the Jumpstart Cloud. We'll call it the Jumpstart Service. We'll call Jumpstart 1, Jumpstart 10. Okay, and it's going to try and deploy to the Jumpstart Cloud. Well, now what it's doing is it's determining which physical servers it wants to deploy to on the Hyper-V and the VMware systems that are inside that cloud. And it's going to look at all of them, and it's going to see whether or not all these things can be deployed. And what should happen is that the first two tiers, the SQL and the web tier here, should work, but the other tier might not. And for each of these tiers, we can determine why they failed. So if we look at the web tier, first of all, we'll look at the VMware tier. We'll click Ratings, and we'll just look at what's the rating explanation as to why it can't deploy. So if we look in here, we have a couple of things. One of them is that we don't have enough disk space. We don't have the right network things set up. So this one probably isn't going to deploy to that cloud. If we look at each of these individual other tiers, we can specify why these are not going to fail as well. So we can see what's going on, and then we can try and make a fix as to why this won't work. So it can't deploy to that one. If we look at HSV03, we can see that this ESX can't deploy to there. Oh, the ESX can't deploy there because it doesn't have the right networking and stuff. So we have the reason why they can't deploy. So what we would have to do is go back and fix all those things, then rerun the thing and have it deploy.
But at least it's a pretty clear explanation of exactly what the problems are, where they are, how to triage them.
And you click into ratings and you figure that stuff out. So let me pick one that should work, that's already out there and available. So I'm going to pick this customer demographics, and we're just going to configure deployment here. We'll call this Jumpstart 10. So it has the same name, and we'll pick a cloud that I know has enough resources to deploy it. So let's hit OK here and see what resources it has, and then we can start kicking off that deployment scenario. Again, now it's looking at all the different servers that are within that administrative cloud, which is actually a lot more host groups. This service is a little bit bigger than the other one. It's a 4-tier service instead of a 3-tier, but it does show me all the different tiers and what can be deployed. And we see that there are no red X's, so this all can be deployed. We also see a couple of things that I think are really interesting, and that is the configurable parameters that we want to pass. So over here on the left, we see the variable name called root BSL machine. Well, root BSL machine is CDS mid BSL02, so I just need to type it in. And what will happen is at deployment time, we will add in these variables and pass them into the VM as we're doing post-app configuration. So the business logic tier knows how to talk to the order processing tier, knows how to talk to the SQL tier, and the web tier. So that's an extra thing that we do that I haven't seen any other vendor be able to support right now.
Now, I see that you've shown a 3-tier topology, a 4-tier topology. We have a question in the queue. Is there any limit as far as the number of tiers that we can have?
I don't know what the upper limit is. I would imagine that the more tiers you have, a couple of things. One, each tier is going to have one or more VMs in it, so you're going to have a larger and larger system. What we actually foresee is not people having much larger server tiers, but they can get to probably 10, 20, 30. I mean, I don't know what that upper limit number is. But what we'll probably see is more people creating single-tier VMs. So instead of deploying a VM by just deploying a VM, you'll deploy a VM as part of a service template, a 1-tier, 1 VM single service template. And the reason for that is that gives you some of the upgrade and the update capabilities that you wouldn't get if it was just a VM.
Well, that actually leads to a great second question we have here. What is the process of upgrading these service tiers? If I have a service, do I need to take the service offline to upgrade it?
So the upgrade of the service tiers will be talked about in the monitor and operate section tomorrow, or in the I think it's 7 or 8 module, and that will go into more and more detail as far as how each of these tiers are created. what I can tell you is that by having this as a service template model, I can update the service template and then push those up and down to all the different deployed services. Because once I've created this one time, I can deploy it over and over and over again without having to go back and do all the work. So I can do the work once and deploy it multiple times. So after I've done that, added in the information here, maybe want to add a cost center, and I want to call a description. Then I can hit deploy service, and it will go off and start the service deployment, which does a few things. One, it deploys all these different VMs. As you can see, 5 different virtual machines here. And secondly, it'll then deploy them, configure them, then do all the post-configuration stuff it needs to do afterwards. So once this thing continues off, I'll flip over and show you what that looks like in the jobs window so you can see what it's doing. And the nice thing about our jobs windows is that it goes through and shows you in really nice detail exactly what's happening, where you're at in the deployment process.
So while that's happening, I've seen a few questions around multi-tenancy with VMM. You know, I'm a hoster, let's say, and I want to go and run certain VMs for one customer, certain VMs for another customer. I want to isolate them. I want to have security.
Sure.
What exactly is our multi-tenancy story with VMM?
So with VMM 2012, it's based off of the different user roles and such. So you would still have to have everybody within your Active Directory. So you'd have to either create an account for each of the different groups. You can split them up in different OUs or whatever for that, but it's still within the VMM 2012 and just straight Active Directory via user roles. So we're looking to enhance that further and handle multi-tenancy a little better in future releases, but I don't have any dates or any times to explain.
But functionally, you can do it today.
You can do somewhat
isolate
today as long as you give them an account that they can log in and look at the virtual machines. Other things that are necessary that make it a little more difficult is that the VMs, when I deploy them in their service templates, I gotta have a domain runners account that can access the domain and those types of things. So getting those input and segregated off, you want to just make sure that you handle that correctly and that I can see my domain run as accounts, but not other ones, those types of things. And at this point, it's going through creating the service instance, and we can see here that it's doing a bits transfer of these files, and they're copying them over from the VMM server over to the Hyper-V server that's deploying it. And I'm deploying 5 different virtual machines. Let me bring this up so we can see more of this window. So I'm deploying all these 5 different virtual machines out there. And as I'm copying this data over, I'm copying 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 gigs of data, and it's going to take me each one about 12 minutes to copy them all over. So after it copies those over there, then it creates the new VM, powers it on, and goes through all the different configuration information for the VM, sysprepped and all that stuff, logs into the domain, and then it goes through and installs the application. So this is going to take a while. It's not going to finish up in the 3 minutes that we have before the end of the session. So let me flip back over to the slides, and we'll finish this session out. So we talked now about taking this logical and standardized environment and building these private clouds and basically blocking off different access to those resources. Then from there, delegating capacity to the users that need it. And those users could be having access to multiple clouds or one cloud, and you can limit how much or how little resources they can consume. And then lastly, allowing them to deploy their service templates upon these clouds. So in the configure and deploy the private cloud infrastructure, we talked about how we were designed to handle this heterogeneous virtualization environment you may have, whether it be VMware, Citrix, or Microsoft hypervisors, abstracting those resources to create a private cloud, delegating the proper access to those private cloud, and then controlling the deployments of or what they can deploy onto that cloud by creating these VM and service templates. So that kind of brings you together all the way through in Module 2, configuring and deploying the private cloud infrastructure components, and then Module 3, now the private cloud infrastructure.
Thank you. That was a great overview. So hopefully you have the basics of the actual fabric, the hardware, how we run it, how we optimize it for the private cloud. In the next module, Sean Christensen is going to be joining us, and we're going to be looking at service delivery and automation. So this is essentially putting the IT guy in the middle. They get requests from an end user. They need to map those requests to specific hardware and then automate the process of deploying this application to this unit of hardware. So we'll join you again after the break, and we'll be right back for service delivery and automation. Thank you.
Thank you.